for New Jersey CPD?
Since 2006.
Okay, where are you presently assigned?
The radio room.
And how long have you been assigned to immigration?
May of 2017.
So you were assigned there in July of 2018?
Yes.
I'd like to direct your attention specifically to July the 28th of 2018. Were you on duty that day?
Yes.
And did there come a time on that day when you received a phone call regarding an incident that took place in your home?
Yes.
And do you remember who called?
It was Detective Celestino.
Do you see Detective Celestino in the courtroom today?
Yes.
If so, can you please point in the direction? Yeah, I was on the record reflect that. No, that's not.
Thank you.
All right. Did you know Detective Celestino prior to receiving that phone call that day?
Yes.
And by the way, just to clarify, what was your maiden name back then?
Pescatore. I'm sorry.
Is that how you identified yourself on that phone call when you received it?
I don't remember.
If you hear it, will it
Yes.
refresh your recollection? Oh. All right, sorry. Now I'm going to have a load onto. Do you remember when you received the phone call?
I don't.
Tried to rob my 39, yelling that gang signs or whatever.
Control, turn right to me.
Hey, sorry.
Do you recognize that voice?
Yes.
Who's that?
That's me.
Okay, let's listen to that.
I got a situation at the foot of Belmont and Lincoln Park.
Do you recognize that voice?
Now I do.
Okay, who's that?
That's Detective Celestino.
Your Honor, at this point, I would ask that S4 be admitted into evidence. I request permission to pay the rest.
No objection. Unanimous without objection.
Let's go through from the
Okay,
beginning.
I'm walking home.
Yeah.
Control, turn right to me.
Hey, sorry. I got a situation at the foot of Belmont and Lincoln Park. I'm walking home. Came from a doctor's appointment and this, I got a mail here. Tried to rob my 39, yelling at gang signs or whatever. I was 13.
Wait, are you alright?
Yeah, no, we're almost getting to February.
Belmont and where?
Belmont and off the west side. No, actually, this is Kensington off the west side.
Kensington off the west side. Okay, what's your name?
Cesar Celestino.
Oh, hey, what's up? It's Sam Pescatore.
Yo, fucking kid, man. I had one, you're gonna have to send the voice of, I had one fish charge out county.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yes.
What, Kensington west side, that's the West District?
Yeah.
Well, we sent a radio car and a boss to Kensington off the west side. Celestino's out there. He was just like told that he needed a boss. He had a discharge. Now him and his son were coffee dates. Yeah. I'm glad you're alright.
Yeah, no, good.
What, they just out of nowhere? They just came up to you and...
This one kid started talking like a Rocky, this and that, and I said, what'd you say? I said, and I didn't know if you had a weapon. I said, your hands on the thing, and turned around, we kind of squared up, and he's kind of like, I'll shoot you, he says, and I said, get back, and my gun went off.
So I'm just glad you guys are alright. Your son's okay?
Yeah, he's good.
Alright, well, he's sending a boss and a car down to you. Alright, you good?
Yeah.
Alright.
Alright, bye.
Bye.
Sergeant, you just heard the full phone call to you on that day. Did Detective Celestino describe to you what had happened to him and his son with regards to what the kid tried to do to him?
Well, only what we just heard.
In terms of whether or not he tried to rob him?
Yeah, that's what he said initially.
And he said it twice during the phone call, is that right?
I don't remember, but okay. If it was on the tape, then yes.
You accept my
Yes.
representation? What did you do as a result of the phone call that you received?
I told the control dispatcher to make notifications to the bosses that were on patrol that day to respond down there.
Okay. When you mentioned the word bosses, what do you mean by that?
Pretty much everyone who was on patrol that day would have responded, sergeants, lieutenants, everyone up to the highest ranking officer, which probably would have been a deputy chief that day.
And if there is a discharge by a police officer, does that require the police officer to call that?
Well, yes. That's how you would get the supervisors to respond.
That's my next question. Did that conclude your involvement in this case?
For the most part, there may have been other notifications that I had to make, like prosecutor's office or maybe internal affairs or the police union, depending what the bosses on patrol would have had me do.
Okay, you mentioned a couple of entities there, so let's just break those up for a moment. Internal affairs, you're talking about Jersey City Police.
Yes,
Police union, you're talking about Jersey City Police.
yes.
In terms of the time of the phone call, I believe it was listed, would 2:16:38 be accurate to your recollection?
I wouldn't remember honestly, but yes, I'll agree with that. But, yeah.
Other than that, I believe I asked you, other than making the phone calls to the supervisors, Jersey City Police Internal Affairs, the union representatives, whoever that may be from the Jersey City Police Department, did that conclude your role in this investigation?
Yeah, I would say so.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, Sergeant.
Good afternoon.
Okay, a few questions for you. Can you tell us what a control sergeant is?
I'm in charge of supervising the civilian dispatchers, call takers for the police and fire, responsible for making notifications for certain calls that would arise.
All right, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is there's a difference between a dispatcher and what you do, correct?
Yes,
A dispatcher oftentimes is civilian,
yes.
Is that the way
they are
Jersey City is?
all civilian.
all
Yes,
civilian.
ma'am.
So you supervise the civilian dispatchers, correct?
Yes,
And if someone were to call in to 911 and make a call, that call wouldn't come directly to you,
no.
correct? That would get out to everybody else.
It would go to the call takers, and they would take up a ticket, and then it would go to the dispatchers.
Okay, and if it was a cell phone that called in, it would get routed through somewhere, and then it would get to the dispatchers in Jersey City?
Depending if they called 911 or just called the regular number.
Okay. If they called 911, it would get routed?
Yes,
Okay. Now, to call you directly, there would be a dedicated line to you, correct?
yes, there's,
And that dedicated line, the police officers know what that number is for central control, right?
yes,
All right. And in this particular case, the call that you got that we just heard with Detective Celestino was a call that was over that number, that separate number.
yes,
Just so we're clear, it wasn't a 911 call, it was a call to a 547 number.
yes,
Okay. And do the officers know when they call in that that line is taped?
absolutely, yes.
And they're all recorded and they're kept separately when there's an incident, the recorded line?
Yes.
Now, what is the protocol? Let's try it. Is this the first time you ever dealt with an officer involved shooting?
In that position as control sergeant, yes.
Okay. And it's the only time, or is it just the first time?
It's the only time.
Only time. Okay. And there's a protocol that's associated with a shooting involving a discharge involving a police officer, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what do you have, like a checklist that you have to go through?
Well, it's mostly just knowing, just experience. All the supervisors have to be notified. Anytime there's a discharge weapon, the prosecutor's office has to be notified.
All right, so as an officer, as a sergeant in the Jersey City Police Department, you're constantly getting general orders and memos from the chief as to protocols and things, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And do one of those indicate that if an officer is involved in a discharge of his firearm, he's required to call you, like happened here?
I would be assuming, but I believe so.
All right. And the reason that, as far as you understand, was that Cesar was calling to get a supervisor, correct?
Yes,
All right. Is that normal protocol that when something happens, an incident occurs, an officer calls in to that taped line and requests a supervisor?
yes.
Okay. And what's the protocol if Officer Celestino, Detective Celestino at this point in time, wanted to file a charge against somebody? Would he call you?
No,
Did you understand when you received that call that you were receiving the information from him for purposes of you filing a charge against this individual?
no, that doesn't happen in the radio.
So tell me what happens. What's your knowledge of how someone gets charged in an incident?
Typically, if someone's charged, they're charged at the district level. It has really nothing to do with control.
So the information that you were getting from Detective Celestino was just sort of a quick description of what happened so that you could understand that there was a discharge and you needed to get a supervisor out there, correct?
Yes,
Right. And was it your understanding that Detective Celestino was still at the scene,
yes.
and as well as the other individual involved?
I didn't ask, I
Okay.
assumed.
Okay. All right. How long have you known Cesar?
I mean, we've had to respond to each other's calls and back each other up on calls, probably since I started in New York City.
Okay,
We
and
were
how long?
neighboring districts on the same tour, so a lot of times we would have to cross over district lines to back each other up,
Okay, how long you been with Jersey City?
since 2006.
2006. If my math is correct, 13 years. And he's been on the job as long as you have.
I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Pretty close, I think.
Okay. And what district were you in?
The East District,
Okay. And what district was he in?
the North.
And what was, when you first started out, or when you knew him in a different district, what was his job in the North District?
Patrol, same as mine in the East.
All right, you wore uniforms,
Yes.
and you drove cars, and you responded to calls, right? And you would deal with him on calls from time to time?
Yes.
So you knew him, but you didn't socialize with him or anything, correct?
No,
Do you know when he became a detective?
I couldn't even guess.
Okay, and where would detectives be assigned vis-a-vis what he was doing before in patrol?
They're also assigned to different districts, but they kind of have separate offices.
And they're typically in plainclothes detectives?
Yes.
So, as I understand it from that call, at first, he didn't recognize you, you didn't recognize his voice, correct?
No, I didn't. It was very low. I don't think I heard who he was at first.
Okay. And it wasn't until he identified himself and he said, "Hey, it's Sam Pescatore."
Yes.
And
No one recognizes my maiden name, so I do that a lot.
but
Just so people
your
know.
married name's tough to say.
Yes.
I mean,
I do.
but you don't mind if I call you Sergeant Pescatore?
That's fine.
All right. So, so Detective Celestino called in, and the first part of the conversation, you didn't know who he was, and then he later identified himself, and then there was a further part of the conversation, correct? When there's an officer-involved shooting, it's pretty chaotic in the radio room. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Because you had to make a number of phone calls after that, correct?
Yes.
You called, all these that are on this list here are all calls that were made relating to this particular incident, correct? Do you recall the call you made to Captain Donnelly right after you spoke to Officer Celestino?
I don't.
Okay. Do you recall in any of the calls, strike that, do you recall speaking to Lieutenant Rotundo from the Jersey Internal Affairs Division?
I don't recall it, but I'm sure if he was the one on duty that day, that has been true.
Do you recall speaking to a Kearns from the Hudson County Prosecutor's Office?
Again, I don't remember, but
You do recall that you did notify the prosecutor's office, right?
yes.
Because that's protocol, you have to.
Yes.
Right. You are familiar with Detective Celestino when you're dealing with him on a regular basis, correct?
Yeah.
How would you describe his demeanor on that call, relating to, compared to when you normally speak to him?
I'd say he's probably rattled.
Okay. Do you recall actually telling Lieutenant Rotundo in one of the calls that he was babbling and he rattled?
No, we don't.
No. You wouldn't be surprised if that's what was on the call.
No, I guess I wouldn't.
Do you recall describing him,
Sidewalk.
Sergeant, as I was asking you, do you recall having described his demeanor as being rattled when he called?
I don't recall, but that's what it says on the tape.
As you sit here today and you listen to it again, would you agree with that?
Yes,
Okay. And that's based upon your personal knowledge of Cesar Celestino as you know him and hearing him on that call?
yes.
Okay. Now, you recall, did he give you, as far as you could tell, the full details of what occurred at the scene?
No,
No. You shake your head. No. Why? Why did you come to that conclusion?
there was still, I didn't even know if the actor was still on scene, I didn't know if he was holding him there. And there's a million questions I could have asked, but I had to start making notifications.
So is it fair to say it wasn't your purpose to get a full investigative report from Detective Celestino as to what happened at the scene, correct?
Yes,
As a matter of fact, as we listen to that, and we're going to play it one more time because I want you to hear it again. At first, he gives a very brief description of what happened, correct?
yes,
And then after the second time when he gives another brief description, you actually ask him what happened, correct?
yes,
It wasn't him volunteering information that you understood to charge somebody with a crime.
no,
Okay. So you wanted to make sure he's okay, you wanted to get a little more detail as to what happened while you were waiting for everybody to do what they needed to do. Because you had somebody behind you named Wally, correct?
yes, that was my patrol dispatcher that day.
Okay. Have you ever seen a transcript of this call?
No,
Do you have copies of the transcript? Because I'd like to give copies of the transcript to the jurors so they could read along as they're listening to the call.
Any objection?
Isn't that what we stipulated to?
What's it marked?
It's not marked yet.
Hasn't been marked, and there's not.
What was D1? Was that was the-
D1 was the,
So would you like to mark this? D2?
I'd like to mark D2, but I
And this is-
inadvertently assumed, I apologize, that the prosecutor had enough copies for the jurors. So, can I just take 1 minute to make copies for the jurors?
First of all, is there any objection to this?
Judge,
Sidewalk. Copies of the stand marked D2, provided for your seats.
Thank you. Sergeant, I have in front of you a transcript of the call that we just listened to.
I think I have it.
Wrong one.
this is only my cell phone video.
So I asked, we're going to listen to that call one more time, and I ask if you could just take a look at the words that are there as you listen to it. Thank you.
Control, Sergeant Maksymiw.
Hey, sorry. I got a situation. I'm at the foot of Belmont and Winter Park. I'm walking home. Came from a doctor's appointment, and I got a mail here. Tried to rob my son and I, yelling at gang signs or whatever. I was 13.
Wait, are you alright?
Yeah, no, we're almost getting to finish.
Belmont and where?
Belmont and off the west side. No, actually, this is Kensington off the west side.
Kensington off the west side. Okay, what's your name?
Cesar Celestino.
Oh, hey, what's up? It's Sam Pescatore.
Yo, I'm just kidding, man. I had one, you can ask this on the board, so I had one fish store just family.
Oh, did you? Okay. What, Kensington West Side, that's the West District?
Yeah.
Well, we sent a radio car and a bus to Kensington off the west side, Celestino's out there, he was just like, assaulted and dangerous as well. He had a discharge. Now, him and his son were talking to me, yeah. I'm glad you're alright.
Yeah, no, good.
Well, they just had nowhere, they just came up to you and,
This one kid started talking like, wow, you this and that, and I said, what'd you say? He did. And I didn't know if you had a weapon. I said, she hands upon the thing, and turned around, we kind of squared up, and he kind of asked, oh, shoot me, he says, and I said, get back, get back. And I'm like,
so I'm just glad you guys are alright. Your son's okay?
yeah, he's good.
Alright, well, we're sending a boss and a car down to you. Alright, you good?
Yeah.
Alright.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you. Sergeant, so you said that your understanding was that he was calling for the purpose of obtaining a boss at the scene, right? All right. And you weren't involved in any charging of any robbery or anything like that, correct? You know what a robbery is, though, correct?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about the first part. He indicates to you that he's coming home from a doctor's appointment. Did you know why he was off duty that day?
No.
And he says, I got a mail here, tried to rob my son and I. Did he describe at any point in time in the call as to when the robbery occurred? Whether it was at the beginning of the interaction, the middle of it, or at the end of the interaction?
I'm sorry, can you say that?
Did he describe at any point in time when that particular robbery occurred?
No.
Okay. And he says he's yelling out gang signs. Did you understand what he meant by that?
I guess that's part of the babbling, but, you know, he said something about MS-13, so.
Okay. In your experience, gang signs are typically nonverbal, correct? You just yell.
Yes.
Okay, so that was what you referred to as babbling?
Yes.
And then he says he almost got into a fight with this kid, right? And then he talks about the discharge that he has accidentally on the second page, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you turn to Wally, who's Wally?
She's the control dispatch.
Oh, the woman, okay. And you were instructing her to get a boss, a supervisor, to get out to the scene, correct?
Yes.
You described it as Cesar having been assaulted.
Yes.
How did you make that leap from robbery to assault?
Well, part of robbery is physical force, so I just assumed that part, I guess.
What's the other part of robbery?
Theft.
Theft. Okay. And an attempted theft with a force would be a robbery, correct?
Depends on the details, could be attempted robbery, but yes.
Okay. And if I were to forcibly take your firearm from you, okay, would that be a theft?
I don't know, you're going into charging now. So
What?
I don't,
You're a police officer. You know, if I forcibly took an item, forget about your gun, any item from you, forcibly took it from you,
yes.
is that robbery?
That's
Is
right.
that theft plus force?
Yes.
And he didn't describe when that happened, correct?
No.
Now, you then ask him, like, what happened out of nowhere, they just came up to you, and he starts to then give a little bit more about what happened, correct? And he talks about, he says, rob you this and that. Do you know what he meant by this and that?
No.
Did it appear that he was giving you the full description of what was being said between the two of them at that point?
No.
And I said, what'd you say? He said, I didn't know if he had a weapon. I said, put your hands on the thing. Now, as a police officer, what did you believe he was trying to convey to you at that point?
I don't know what you mean.
Okay, so first he says, I didn't know if he had a weapon, all right? So based upon what you were learning, you indicate you were of the belief that he was trying to determine if he had a weapon, correct?
Yes.
And he says, I put your hands up on the thing. Did you know what he meant by that?
Not really. It sounds like he was trying to arrest them. I don't know, but I'm
Okay.
assuming.
Is that typically what you do as an officer if you wanted to arrest someone, to have them put their hands up on something while you did that?
Objection.
If you know.
Sidebar. Sidebar.
So Sergeant, as I was asking, is that something, in your understanding as a police officer, that if you were going to try to see if someone had a weapon, you would have them put their hands up on something to do that?
That's standard. You also always want to watch hands because that's where the danger is.
Okay. He indicates then he turned around, we kind of squared up, and he's telling us, "I'll shoot you," he says, correct?
Yes,
And then he says, "I said, get back," and my gun went off, correct?
yes.
So he's indicating that the threat to shoot occurred before his gun went off, is that correct? In that, just
In
in that
this, yes.
short little description of what happened.
Yes.
You didn't file any charges, correct?
No,
Did you call anyone and tell them to file charges for robbery?
no, that doesn't fall under that purview, control supervisor.
And you said Jersey City Police protocol is not, officers are not calling you to file a charge.
No, they would speak to the district lieutenant for that.
Do you recall, strike that, so you made a whole bunch of phone calls that day. You called homicide, you called, the prosecutor's office, you called the CIC, who's the CIC?
I don't recall that day.
Okay. Do you recall when you were, strike that, at some point during these calls, you were relating to other people what Cesar had told you, correct?
Yes,
All right. And you recall in several of the calls, you said Officer Celestino identified himself as an officer.
that's right to me.
Do you recall telling Captain Donnelly, Kearns, and Rotundo in separate calls that Cesar Celestino identified himself as a police officer?
I honestly don't remember.
You don't remember? You know where you would have gotten the information, if that's what you did, where you got the information from?
I don't understand.
If I played a call for you,
Okay.
would that refresh your recollection?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you play the call, the second call, Captain Donnelly?
What's this mark, D3?
You can mark it down. A second. So this is. Yeah, what's the timing?
Hello? Oh,
For the record, the timing of this call is 14:20 and 53 seconds, which is 2:20:53, correct? And, non-military time, is that correct?
yes, I'm sorry, Chief, it's not, wasn't for you, I'm trying to find out from State Police right now, I have him on the phone, hold on. Do you want to know, do you want me to respond, or is it your quarantine, or are you guys gonna process?
Yeah, just as long as they roll up for that, we're definitely gonna have a guy respond to, take care of the scene, just make sure, obviously, you know that.
So just maintain the scene, don't send DPI then?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right, okay, practice level, hang on 1 second.
Okay, so we're good.
Yes, you hearing the monitoring? Cesar Celestino was at the park with his kid and he was approached by some MS-13 members. He identified himself, pulled his gun out, told him to put his hands up, and the guy said, "I'll shoot you," and he discharged. Celestino had an accidental discharge. The guy still on the scene says he's on the phone. Looks like he's trying to call.
He said that was discharge?
Well, I guess he didn't need a discharge, I don't know.
Notify prosecutor's office on that now.
Okay, no problem, thanks.
Okay, so do you recognize that voice as Captain Donnelly?
Yes.
And he was in charge of the city that day, correct? The whole entire city? Did you hear what he said? He identified, meaning Cesar Celestino identified himself as a police officer, the other individual identified himself as MS-13.
Yes.
Where did you get that information?
I guess I assumed that based on the fact that he pulled his gun out.
I have no further questions, thank you.
Just a couple of questions before we end the deal. The first, questions that Detective Celestino told you about were, if you look and you read, the jurors have a copy of the transcript as well. And I'm looking at CC line 13. I got a mail here, tried to rob my son and I. He's reporting what happened to him, to you at that point, is that right?
Yes.
He didn't first report to you that he had an accidental discharge, did he?
Not at first.
No, he was telling you that he was robbed, he and his son, is that right?
Yeah, that they were trying to rob him.
And then later he repeated the fact that he and his son were robbed. I'm looking at page 2, line 16. There's this one kid. He started talking like, robbed you, this and that. And I said, what did you say? You see that?
Yes.
Again, was he reporting to you what had taken place at the incident at that time? Based on that representation, the one that I asked you about before, about robbing?
Not in that first sentence.
In the subsequent calls that you made to the other individuals, the notifications to the Internal Affairs Department, to the union representatives from Jersey City Police, did you explain to them that Detective Celestino had called in a robbery to you?
I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly what I said on each of the calls. I'm
In
assuming it would have been pretty similar to what I told the CIC.
Okay, so in describing the incident as Detective Celestino described it to you, did you convey to those individuals that he and his son was robbed, in addition to assault?
Got by that phone call, yes.
Thank you. I don't have further questions.
So when you're relating it to the other people, the word robbery doesn't even enter into your mind, right? You say assault, correct? That wasn't something that jumped out at you.
Well, assault is part of robbery, so.
Okay. And you interpreted what he said. I mean, he used the word rob. He didn't think he had a 2C code open in front of him that he was looking at to say robbery, the definition, criminal definition of robbery, right? He's using the word rob, right? And he said tried to rob me,
Yes.
okay? And you interpret that as assault, you said. And he wasn't calling you for the purpose of charging anybody, correct?
No.
The reason he was giving you some detail, correct me if I'm wrong, is because you were going to send officers to respond, and they needed to have some idea of what they're getting themselves into when they get at the scene, correct?
Yes.
Right? So he told you the guy was still there, tried to rob him, threatened to shoot him. The officers needed to know when they got there what they were going to be dealing with.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.